Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Ben Cohen from the Wall Street Journal, discussing his new book, The Hot Hand, The Mystery and Science of Streaks. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Ben Cohen about his new book, The Hot Hand. In the interview, we discuss how new data has shed light on this now 35-year-old debate, how the perception of the hot hand influences other people, and how this concept can be applied to other domains like filmmaking. Hope you enjoy. Today, I'm joined by Ben Cohen, talking about his new book, The Hot Hand, The Mystery and Science of Streaks. So thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Ben.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background as a writer and kind of interests in this area?
Yeah, I am a reporter for the Wall Street Journal's sports page and have been for about 10 years now since graduating from college. So my interest in this really comes from two things. The first is that I have my own personal experience with the hot hand, which is that I have felt it for myself. Like I think most people, I think this is a really universal phenomenon. I think we all, have felt or seen the hot hand for ourselves. Mine happened in a junior varsity basketball game about 15 years ago. I was a terrible high school basketball player, but in one quarter of one game, I scored more points than I had in my entire career combined. And that experience stuck with me. And then the second thing, that sort of led me to write a book about the hot hand was that in 2014 and 2015, I wrote two stories about the hot hand for the Wall Street Journal. And usually what happens once I write a story, when I am done reporting and thinking and writing that story, is that I really don't want to think about that story anymore. I'm kind of exhausted by it. But the opposite happened here. I could not get the hot hand out of my head. And so, it's sort of my own experience playing sports. And then, the last decade writing about sports for the Wall Street Journal that led me to this place.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have to admit, I have the same feeling I've had about my sporting experience. And I know what we can talk about later. One of the really interesting aspects of your book is you also go beyond sports, talking about hot hands in other domains. And you have a really interesting story about the Princess Bride, making of the movie The Princess Bride, that kind of connects that we can get to. But I want to ask you, so the hot hand, obviously people listening, if you've read any of the literature on it's a very controversial. You have one strong side of fans and, what we were talking about that believe in it passionately, then the academic statistician side, not so much. So what was your experience when you started to dive into that, the literature and what the consensus was when you jumped in?
Well, that fight is what was so alluring to me about this whole project. I mean, working for the Wall Street Journal, I have been trained to look for tension in stories, right? Tension is what really makes a great story. And I just could not believe how much tension there was in this fight over a single idea. Like this was a story in which, it involved something that we all thought to be true, only to be told by really smart people that it wasn't. Only to realize in recent years that maybe it actually was. And it's this saga in which the characters are Nobel Prize winners and NBA superstars and like some of the biggest athletes on the planet. So you're right, that first paper that was published in 1985 was this classic paper in the canon of behavioral economics, and it's called The Hot Hand in Basketball. And what made it so classic was the counterintuitive conclusion, which is that there is no such thing as the hot hand. It's simply a matter of seeing patterns in randomness. It's this very accessible, easily digestible cognitive bias. It's our minds playing tricks on us. And when that paper came out, it caused a real stir. It was a sensation. People simply refused to believe it. That's how unbelievable it was. It didn't matter that these brilliant psychologists were the authors. I mean, the great Amos Tversky put his name on this paper, and that should have sort of changed all of our minds. And yet people just refused to believe it. Even in the paper itself, they polled basketball players. And what they found was that they all believed in the hot hand. And not only that, but that they all said that you should behave as if you believe in the hot hand, which is to say that you should pass the ball to someone when they are hot, right? Like it really should change the way you think and you judge and you make decisions. And that's what made this paper so like contrarian and delicious, which is that it disproves something that we all thought to be true because we had all felt it and seen it for ourselves.
I think one of the other authors on that paper is Tom Gilovich. I always remember he has a quote. I think he says, I've won every argument, but I've convinced no one. Right?
Yeah, that was actually Amos Tversky, which is
was it Tversky? Yeah.
I was thinking about it because I think that I actually think that sums up the way that all of us feel about the hot hand. Even those of us who really respect and believe in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology and expertise and scholarly work. Like if you are one of those people and you read this paper, you probably should believe in the hot hand. And yet you might not have, right? Like you might have understood that this paper existed and respected its existence while still believing in the exact opposite, and sometimes even behaving as if you believe in the exact opposite.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think it's a topic of paradoxes and contrasts. Like another one that I see is you start off, it's this fascinating topic of streaks and hot hands and winning championships. And then you dive in and it turns into an argument of, is it this distribution or this Bayes? Like it gets really nitty gritty, tedious for the outsider, tedious stats on trying to decide what's the right way to analyze a streak and what's the right way. So how did you find breaking into that? Was that kind of a hard, I know for me, that's a really hard thing to get into this area.
Yeah, it's really tricky. And the other thing that's frustrating about this argument is that people just want to know the answer. They want to know, well, is it real or is it not? And should I believe in it? And should I not? And it's not really the point of the book. The point of the book, I think, is to sort of play around with the idea and toy with it for yourself and try to figure out where you land. Because where I land, the way I think about it these days is that there are certain environments and industries and walks of life where there is such a thing as the hot hand and that you can take advantage. But there are also environments where there is no such thing as the hot hand, and believing in the hot hand can backfire and burn you a little bit. And part of the fun of all of this is looking around and trying to figure out whether you are in an environment that allows for a hot hand or whether you're in an environment that punishes belief in the hot hand. So I think you could really be on both sides of this debate. And it's a debate, as you said, that has been raging for 35 years now. And, there are all types of issues of how we think about it, right? So in terms of sampling, but even in terms of the data that is supporting the arguments in this. So that 1985 paper was based on the best data available in 1985 for basketball researchers. Now, the fact is that data looks pretty primitive now. It's just not very good. But at the time, there was nothing better. So the data that was available to people who wanted to look at the NBA in 1985 is very different than it was in 2014. And the data in 2014 is very different than it is in 2020. So, I think one of the lessons of this book is that we have to be willing to change our minds if the evidence suggests it. We should really be questioning and challenging our long-held assumptions and trying to let the data lead us in new directions, because sometimes it will tell us things that it's never said before.
Yeah, I think that's a great lesson for not only this specific case, but going on right now in the world, right? There's no such thing as the science, right? Science is not one definitive answer all the time. So yeah, I think back to that point you make about kind of separating, I think you call it real versus non-existent streaks, I think. And I think also maybe that relates to separating the hot hand from things like when we know the gambler's fallacy, where we know people are kind of making irrational assumptions about things going on. So can you talk a little bit about how you distinguish that in the book and examples?
Yeah, so I like to think of the hot hand and the gambler's fallacy. The easiest way to think about them both is through basketball. So, the hot hand, if you walk into an NBA arena and you see Steph Curry make 3 shots in a row, everybody thinks he's making a 4th shot. That's the hot hand. But if you walk into a casino and you go to the roulette wheel and you see red 3 times in a row, what research has shown is that most people will actually bet on black the next time. And that's the gambler's fallacy. So the difference is when you think about it, why do you have these streaks of 3 and we bet on the exact opposite outcomes? What's the difference? To me, the crucial distinction there is the one of control. Mm-hmm. When we think that we are in control and we have agency of our own lives and situations, we think that we can get hot and we bet accordingly. But when we recognize that we are at the mercy of chance and that it's simply luck, we change our bets, right? And we bet on the streak to end instead of continue. And that has all types of consequences and implications for a whole bunch of different industries, whether it's, asylum courts, as I write about in the book, or baseball. Like, baseball umpires have been shown to behave and make decisions under the gambler's fallacy, and those have really high stakes in a baseball game. And so I think one of the things I've learned thinking about the hot hand is that once you start to think about the hot hand, you kind of bump into it anywhere you go.
Yeah, you're right. I think you're exactly right. The agency, whether we assign it's because of Steph Curry's action or there's some mythical fate that somehow the next time black is due, somehow I always ask people.
And the other thing is that the casinos encourage this behavior.
Yeah.
Like, they want you to think this way. So if you go to a roulette wheel, you will see those electronic scoreboards, and they have the last 20 numbers, and they have the breakdown of red and black. I mean, those fundamentally mean nothing, right? These are independent spins of the wheel. What happens on one spin has no effect on what happens the next. But what they're essentially encouraging you to do is to chase these patterns. They want you to be thinking in terms of the hot hand and the gambler's fallacy, because they know that over the long run, that is good for the businesses of Las Vegas, Nevada. And it's why so many of us, leave Las Vegas having made charitable donations to the tourism board there.
Yeah, they're good at that. With the umpire example you mentioned, is that you're meaning by that, umpires will try to balance out their calls in referees?
Their own decisions. So there was one sort of great paper a couple of years ago that looked at the gambler's fallacy among asylum courts and loan applications and baseball games. And what they found was that, umpires who call 2 strikes in a row on close pitches, if a third close pitch happens, they're much more likely to call it a ball to try to even out that streak in their own mind. And so I think, we sort of know that intuitively. Like, we know that if there's an 0-2 count and there's a close pitch, probably it's going to be called a ball instead of a strike. But what this one did that was so interesting to me was that it took only close pitches, and it found that they're trying to even out the streak in their own mind. And baseball's sort of a trivial example of that, but it also applies in asylum courts and refugees who want to come to the United States. And what this paper found was that asylum judges are much less likely to grant asylum if they have just granted asylum 2 or 3 times in a row. So that's a really crushing example. It's really depressing, right? I mean, regardless of the merits of your case, you could be denied asylum simply because the applicants before you were granted asylum.
Yeah, that relates to a thing I was going to ask you about. We talked a bit about earlier, whether you believe the hot hand is a statistical noise or it's a real thing. These streaks, people change their behavior based on them. Right. And you gave the example of, we tend to pass more to someone who's made a few shots in a row. Is there other kind of examples you found of that in other domains or other sports where people are changing their behavior based on these?
Yeah, I think it really, it warps the behavior of everybody around you. And one of the things that's most powerful about this phenomenon of the hot hand is that, the hot hand, that little blip of success in some cases can allow for longer periods of sustained success. So, in the book, I read about the making of the movie The Princess Bride. And what happened there was that Rob Reiner got hot. And, you could think about how this works with Hollywood directors. If you're hot, if you've just directed a couple movies in a row that were either critically successful or commercially successful, or both, there are resources available to you that weren't there before. Screenwriters want to work with you. They send you their best scripts, right? Actors, want to be in your presence. Producers want to throw money at you. It actually becomes easier for you to make another hit movie because you've made a hit movie. And the same thing happens in sports and especially basketball. Steph Curry has license to take crazier, riskier, longer shots when he's hot. And, sometimes, those are shots that would earn even him like a permanent spot at the end of the bench. But because he is hot, he can do that. He can take these heat checks and they can sort of elevate his career and change his life. And it turns out that, we know that the hot hand warps the behavior of everybody around us. It warps the behavior of the shooter in basketball. It warps the behavior of his teammates who want to get him the ball and call plays for him. But it also warps the behavior of the defense, right? They throw double teams at him. The coach tries to call a timeout to blunt his momentum. And the reason why we now think in basketball that it's okay to believe in the hot hand is because research has shown in recent years, looking at player tracking data, they've been able to account for that shift in behavior more than ever before. So Steph Curry takes harder shots when he feels hot. And you can't simply judge his shooting percentage. You can't think about whether or not he's more likely to make a shot just on shooting percentage alone, right? You have to take into account that harder shot. And only recently are we able to do that. So it's almost as if the hot hand has been disguised and masked by the hot hand for 35 years.
Yeah, that's a great point. So that's what when you talked about the new data, I'm sure it's both volume and you're right, the finer grain analysis, being able to see it, not just increasing the probability of the next shot, it's increasing the probability of the next even more difficult shot.
Someone making 2 or 3 shots in a row is nice to know, but you really want to know what types of shots they are and how closely someone was defended and how far away from the basket he's shooting. I mean, this really granular level of detail that only like in the last 5 or 6 years are researchers able to parse, because that data that we have now just, wasn't available to those researchers in 1985 in their nerdiest, wildest, wonkiest dreams, or else they would have done exactly this. They wanted the best data. It just didn't exist.
Yeah, no, that kind of agrees with kind of a philosophy I have about kind of being clutch. In a way, it's maintaining performance as the conditions get difficult rather than elevating. Like maybe there's some elevation, but to me, like the great players in playoffs in baseball and are really not only they're kind of doing the same thing, but under bigger stakes, harder defense, more pressure. They're also taking more responsibility. Like Stephen Curry takes more responsibility for the outcomes of games than the average player. So
that's so interesting. Yeah. So it's like a plateau of performance rather than a dip.
Yeah, it's rather maintaining it under more difficult conditions. So I think it's sort of the similar thing you're saying. So you really we don't, when analyzing the data from high end, we didn't really think of the fact that if I keep making shots, the next shot doesn't have the same probability because you're going to start covering me more, right? So the chance of making the next shot should be going down, not staying
right.
the
So
same.
If you're a 50% shooter and you keep shooting 50% when you're hot, it's probably evidence that there is a hot hand, right? It was always taken as evidence against the hot hand, but it probably is evidence for the hot hand. Yeah,
exactly. And what about, we talked about people's changing their behavior and around them. How resistant are people to unlearning it? It seems like people are I'm thinking of coaches and managers. Once they begin to rely on someone, they want to believe that they're going to keep doing it, even contrary to the evidence. And we want to keep passing to the hot guy. We want to keep investing in the great director. And we kind of stick with them, even though the evidence might be going.
The question is, when should we stop, right? And how do we recognize that? And I think it's one of the great mysteries of all of this. It's like, Stephen Curry, I use him as an example a lot, but he's also probably not a great example because regardless of whether or not Steph Curry is hot, you probably want him shooting the ball, right? Mm-hmm. He's the greatest shooter in the history of the planet. It makes sense for him to shoot. The better example is Draymond Green, not a great 3-point shooter, but if he makes 3 or 4 in a row, do you want to get him the ball? And then when do you want to stop getting him the ball? And I think that's a great question for Steve Kerr. And I'm very happy it's not one that I have to answer with millions of people watching every game.
Yeah. The other thing I've been really interested in, I don't know if you got into this in the book, is the flip side, the cold hand. Did you look into that at all? Cold streaks in performance and things?
I did not, but I think that there is an interesting tie to the hot hand, which is, there's this one researcher, a statistical physicist at Northwestern named Dashan Wang, who is the person responsible for this paper about Hollywood directors. He wanted to look at hot streaks in creative industries. And so he looked at movie makers and he looked at scientists and he looked at artists and he tried to find some objective data to put to these really subjective fields. So for movies, it's IMDb ratings, and for artists, it's auction prices, and scholars, and scientists, it's Google Scholar citations. So not perfect metrics, but about the best that we have to judge the quality of someone's work. And what he found is that our best work comes in bunches. Our creative hits are clustered. And so if he knows what your best work is, probably your second and third and fourth best work is somewhere around that best work. So he calls this the hot hand period of your career. And in the hot hand period, that's sort of what happens then is what we remember and what other people remember about us. And, one of the questions that he gets a lot is, how do I know if I've had my hot hand period already? How do I know if it's past or if it's on the horizon? And his advice is sort of optimistic, which is that you actually don't know. What you think of as your hot hand period when you're 25 might not be your hot hand period when you look back on it when you're 75. And the only way to figure it out is to keep going, like to keep working and keep trying to elevate. And I think that's actually the best way to sort of break a cold hand and get out of a slump. It's just to keep going. I mean, it can be, almost ignorant, kind of arrogant at times. Like, sometimes the reason you don't get hot is because you're not going to get hot. And confidence can turn into something that really backfires. But in the absence of better evidence, that's really the best conclusion that we can make at this time, I think.
Yeah, no, that agrees exactly with what my view of it is. I've always argued cold streaks are kind of different than hot streaks because, say Stephen Curry misses 3 shots in a row. That's entirely possible based on a 50% shooter. It's not that unusual. But cold streaks for some athletes drive them to do something different. They start, let's release the ball. They start focusing on what they're doing. Let's release with a higher elbow, and that makes things even worse. It takes
I think that's especially true in golf and tennis and baseball. I was a high school baseball player, and like any baseball player, there were times when a ball looked like a beach ball, and there were times when it looked like a golf ball. And I think there's a real power and a force to this phenomenon of the hot hand, because I remember at the end of my high school baseball career, when I was a senior, I kind of ended the season on a slump. I just couldn't hit my way out of a paper bag. And, I thought about playing college baseball, but that experience at the end of my high school baseball career, when I just couldn't get a hit and nothing was going my way, it's really demoralizing. And you if my career had ended on a hot streak instead, it might have changed my willingness to keep playing baseball. So, if I had read Dash and Wang's paper to sort of keep going, and you never know, it might have changed my life. Instead, I, decided to start writing about the hot hand instead.
I haven't played golf in a long time, but used to play. I always find that somehow fate intervenes to give you one good shot on the last few holes.
That's a terrible thing on golf. Is that you take 90 terrible shots when you go out, but you get that one on the 17th fairway, and you're like, well, I guess I got to come back tomorrow, right?
I've got it now.
It's like that beauty, it's just, it feels so good, and you can remember that click, and you just want to keep chasing that.
Yeah. And I guess the last question I have, kind of in doing all this where there's some kind of unanswered questions, I think you already talked about a few that you thought of, and research ideas that came up that you'd like to see people explore in this area.
What I really want to know more about is what's actually happening in our minds when we get hot. And so this is a question that's been studied by psychologists and economists, but really I'd love to see this studied by neurologists. I want to see the fMRI scans of our brain and see the different neurons lighting up when we get hot, because I would love to know what's happening with our brain chemistry and why we are so predisposed to searching for these patterns and chasing a hot hand. In the book, I talk a little bit about the evolutionary psychology of all of this and how it was evolutionarily ingrained into us over the course of a very, very long time to search for patterns because of foraging and hunting and gathering. And there were always rewards for seeing the world in clumps and patterns. But I really want to know, is there a way to sort of train our brains to account for all of this? And of course, the great unanswered question of hot hand studies is there a way to put ourselves in a position to get hot? Can we know if that day is going to be a hot day or not? I asked no less than Steph Curry about this. Do you know when you're going to get hot? And he says he has no idea when it's going to happen or where or how or why it's going to happen. But once it does happen, you have to embrace it. And I think that's really a nice way to think about all of this. We can't know when it's going to happen, but once it does happen, we have to embrace it. And so that's the way I think about it now. We just embrace it and try not to get burned by it.
Yeah, no, I think that those are some really interesting ideas. I think it connects with some of the research on things like flow and psychological momentum. And there's some really interesting ideas. I think you're right. It's kind of a mix of making it happen and letting it happen. The hot end, you have to kind of...
And being willing to take advantage when it does, right? Knowing, being able to sort of look for that hot hand in our own lives and being nimble enough to capitalize when it does strike. Because the one thing that we actually really know about the hot hand is that it doesn't last forever. It runs out. And so we all want to try to bottle that magical feeling for as long as we can.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And yeah, so thanks for doing this, Ben. As I said, I really enjoyed the book. I think it's a good entry into like I said, it can be a really dense topic once you get into the stats. And I think you did a great job explaining it. And so The Hot Hand, The Mystery and Science of Streaks, and it's out now, right? In all the usual places, Amazon and
correct. And your local bookshop. It's a great time to support your local bookshop.
Definitely. So thanks very much for doing this, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Ben. If you're looking for something new to read, I would highly recommend The Hot Hand. It's a really interesting and fun read. Link in the show notes for more info and ways to buy. And remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.